our sponsor today. Our sponsor today is BioCatch, and our topic is gleaning emotional insights from online behavior, how financial institutions can build better customer experiences while reducing risk. What a great conversation. I had a lot of fun actually preparing for this session today. But before we get started, I want to just make sure we go over a couple of housekeeping things. First and foremost, I know many of you are in need of CPE credits. So if you are in need of a CPE credit, let us know at the end of the webinar and fill out that survey. And that will tell us that you are needing that. We want you to make sure you put your CPE number, and we will send you an email tomorrow morning with your information so you can make your deposit. We also have just an incredible agenda planned. We're going to meet our panelists today. And of course, we're going to hear from BioCatch, who is our sponsor. We'll jump into our discussions on this really interesting topic. And then, of course, we'll have our Q&A session. Our Q&A session, I'm going to ask each and every one of you to think about a question to ask and put that Q&A in the Q&A chat window at 2:35. We'll cover as many questions as possible. And again, we truly appreciate you joining us today. We'll wrap things up at 2:45, giving you a couple of minutes to freshen up and go to your next meeting. So let's go ahead and get started with our panelist introductions. We have Phyllis Woodruff here today, who's the Vice President, IT Risk and Compliance at Global Payments. Hey, Phyllis, thanks for joining us. Would you mind introducing yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Absolutely, Marcy. Thank you so much for having me here today. I have been at Global Payments for just about the last 18 months, but I've been in financial services for going on the better part of 20 years, I'm afraid. So this is a topic that is near and dear to me. I've been in security for the majority of that time, or risk, and it's critical that we keep our consumers safe.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And that's what we're going to dive into shortly. Xavier Ash, great to have you here. Xavier, I know you're the SVP of Cybersecurity Operations at Truist. And I know at Truist Park has been some real exciting games going on there with the Atlanta Braves. So go Braves.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Xavier Ash here. I've got about 38 years experience in security. Been at Truist coming from SunTrust. And if you're not familiar with Truist, it is the merger of SunTrust and BB&T. So we are getting ready to finish all of the merger work here in the next couple months. And so you'll see plenty of signs change over from either SunTrust or BB&T over to Truist. So we are finally executing on all that merger work that we've been doing the last couple of years. So it's been an exciting trip, and I'm happy to be here to talk about this fun topic today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Xavier. And Ayelet Bigger Levin, you have quite the name there. I like your name, though. It's very, very beautiful. You are the VP of Market Strategy with BioCatch, and we'd love to hear more about you and, of course, learn about BioCatch. We appreciate your sponsorship of today as well.
It's our pleasure. Thanks for having me here. So, yeah, I'm a VP Market Strategy at BioCatch. I'm based out of Boston. I've been with the company for 2 years. Prior to BioCatch, I've had over 20 years of experience in the tech industry. Spent the 11 years prior to BioCatch at RSA Security, focused on preventing fraud and identity theft. So a little bit about BioCatch. Our vision is really, customer experience is the hallmark of growing revenue in digital channels. But the revenue can be threatened by losses sustained from new account fraud, account takeover fraud, and other cyber threats like scams. And as the volume of digital transactions surges, especially we've seen that in the pandemic, where it's, digital moved from one channel to digital only, fraud and risk management leaders are tasked with building trust across a broad range of use cases, managing risk across digital channels, and limiting financial losses from cybercrime. So BioCatch helps financial institutions and digital businesses build an online environment where customers feel safe to interact by analyzing a user's cognitive and digital behavior to distinguish between genuine users and criminals in order to detect fraud and identity theft and improve customer experience.
Well, thank you very much. You guys are doing some really, really interesting things out there, and I'm excited to jump into our discussions now. Well, let's go ahead and top with the first question. All right. So first and foremost, I know we have been living in the pandemic world, and one of the things that when I was getting ready for this webinar was I hadn't really thought about the pandemic effects on a user population, but it's really driven actually a new class of users and those that are older, vulnerable, and just online hesitant. And I think of some of my family members or my older friends, and really concur with that sentiment of how they've really had to suddenly do things very differently because they might want to have gone to in person to the bank or shopping or certainly healthcare because we did on person before the pandemic. So that transition really from going from the bank branch, for example, to using a mobile and digital bank has created some great opportunities for hackers out there, but has made the end users and the customers really risk prone and easier targets from online fraud because a lot of these folks just don't have the computer system set up at their own home or their older versions of software. And they're really just not necessarily in tune with all the things that can happen online, but they certainly have to do things. So, the hackers out there or the threat actors are putting out forth hybrid bots and remote access tools and social engineering scams such as BEC, and pay pushing that have really thrived during the pandemic. And cybersecurity professionals agree with the challenge to balance the protection and efficiency and really have this ultimate goal to have a really good user experience, because that is critical if you're going to be doing any kind of online transactions, because it needs to feel seamless, frictionless as well. You have to have a trust in what's happening. If so something glitchy happens, they're going to distrust it and perhaps sign out of the transaction entirely. So Xavier, you being at Truist and just going through a huge merger between SunTrust and BB&T Bank, and we had a conversation the other evening, and I was really excited to hear that you've taken the best of breeds from both organizations and kind of did a net new company called Truist with all of your technology and your security processes and solutions out there. So I really want to hear from you first. What firsthand experiences have you had during the pandemic that have affected your vulnerable, more high-risk consumers, kind of the ones that we just talked about that might have not been your online customers traditionally? And what are you kind of doing out there at a high level from a cybersecurity perspective to earn the trust and accommodate these people that are not might necessarily be as savvy as one of us on this webinar today?
Sure. Yeah, the challenge is always being able to put forth a collection of security controls that will match with all these different types of consumers. And absolutely, we had a large number of our clients that before the pandemic would have not done as much through our app and our digital channels. And so that really helped kind of set the stage for what does the user experience need to be like for these end users, giving the highest level of security to all users, but not by introducing additional friction or additional steps that the user has to take. This has to be something that all of our clients can consume. And most, when you think of banking, most people think of client bank or consumer banking where individuals are checking theirs, but we also deal with a whole lot of other range of financial instruments, and those type of applications, again, not a lot of depended a whole lot on the in-person experience. You go in to talk to your personal banker, investment banking, commercial banking, those type of things. And so as we built out the Truist platform, all of that went into that consideration is that we wanted to make sure that, everybody has the same experience, is very secure. And it doesn't matter if you are old or new at this, that you're able to get what you need to, and not be slowed down by security. Security did not want to be in the way in onboarding all of our new digital clients.
That brings me back to some of I'm going to date myself, back in the early part of 2000, when there was such resistance to bringing security into just our companies for our end user population. And they always said, hey, your update of your antivirus is slowing me down. But, really sort of those concepts have transcended to our new end user population out there for each of the financial institutions and retailers that are doing these types of transactions out there. So you brought up some really great points, and I'm glad to hear that you guys are really thoughtful about that. Phyllis, you had a different perspective, being at Global Payments, but you have seen probably some crazy things over the last 12 to 18 months.
Crazy things. Yeah, I absolutely have. One of the things I want to note is that our older population was at risk even before the pandemic. Right, they were targeted. We saw, if you look at states, even such as Florida or Arizona, that have very, very high retirement populations, those were the areas that were being targeted most aggressively. So I think this is spot on in terms of the pandemic just making that so much worse. And they are also, again, because they're used to that in-person touch, because they may not have the sophistication. And as they age, they may have cognitive decline as well. We need to make security as frictionless as possible, which is where something like BioCatch is so incredibly valuable. It is tracking everything they do and knowing them through everything they're doing. I think that would be a fair way to put it. And that means immediately that there's nothing extra for them to do, right? Which is really a phenomenal thing. I know myself, it's you log on to your own computer, and for some reason, the password that you thought was saved is not saved. And all of a sudden you're having to reconstruct it and all else. It's that friction slows things down. And in a busy day, that's not a happy thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what do you think, in terms of prevention around the greatest reason for around online fraud? I mean, that you've seen some of the greatest reason. I mean, you mentioned it, that being their age and sort of naivete, out there, but I mean, you think is it all age or usability driven, or just are they getting more clever?
The hackers are getting more clever, the threat actors, without a doubt. And they're also getting more persistent. I cannot tell you how much just what looks like a phishing scam on my phone looks like in terms of texting. And it's just like, yeah, no, I'm not going to let you on my phone because that's got my bank account on it, right? As the technology has spread, as mobile apps have become more and more prevalent, right? The threat actors have spread out as well. And it's not, frankly, only our older consumers. It's also our younger consumers who may simply be more trusting.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Ayelet, I love your perspective, because one of the things I always love is getting our sponsor perspective, because you're working with so many different customers out there. And I'd love to hear from what you're seeing with your clients. What steps are they taking to really board these new consumers into these types of services, and going forward with mobile and digital banking, which is, really how people, it's so hard to sometimes even get into a bank overall if the branch is actually physically open. So you really are relegated to mobile and digital banking, even if you don't want to do that now. So what top things, 3 things that you're seeing and that are challenges, and in this process and why?
Yeah, so I think the point that Phyllis made is an excellent point about vulnerable customers and the elderly population. We've seen even before the pandemic, from a fraud perspective, that the elderly population is more highly targeted in the ratio of fraud per per generation compared to account openings that the elderly population, the genuine elderly population, actually attempts to open. And that's a challenge because financial institutions need to introduce controls that look at that population in particular, and that's challenging. We don't want to do that. So we need to put in controls that are seamless, like Phyllis said, and are helping the user in a privacy preserved manner, but are helping the user transact freely with a sense of security, and us really as financial institutions gaining the right level of insight into the activity that they're doing. Another element here is, as it pertains to the elderly population and all the scams, is the shame factor. And we know that from research that has been published, that about 30 to 35% of scams are being reported, but all the rest are not. And people are ashamed to be scammed, and that cognitive deterioration. But it's not only the elderly. Many people are scammed, and they are hesitant. They feel foolish. How did I fall for that? So that's an element that is a little tricky because the financial institutions don't necessarily have responsibility there. But there are a lot of controls that they can put in place to protect against those types of scams. So the right controls at account opening to ensure that although personal identity information, was captured by cyber criminals, if we put the right controls, like for example, what we do at BioCatch is we look at whether the user is presenting signs of data familiarity, means they know their data very well, like a genuine user, or they show signs of short-term memory use or lack of data familiarity. We do that by collecting those interaction events with the device, the touch, the swipe, all these control points, and look at the way they enter the data, not the data itself. Another example is familiarity with a process. Someone entering many account applications a day, like a cyber criminal, will be very, very familiar with the process of opening an account, but they won't be, a genuine user will not be familiar with that process. So there are all these nuances that we can collect without introducing friction. And those are some of the challenges and controls. Just one last point here. We've seen younger populations actually falling victims, I would say, of mule accounts. So being recruited, that's the population that was, hit financially. They lost their jobs and they look for working at home jobs that can give them fast money. And some of them willingly and some of them unknowingly falling victims to mule gangs and participating in that. And that's something, using their own information to open an account and help cyber criminals funnel money out of those accounts. So that's also something that we need to look at as financial institution. How do we protect against mule accounts?
You are like perfect for my next transition into our next topic around balancing the friction and the customer experience. So it's awesome. I love it. I love it. This is such a cool topic. So what you kind of really touched on, Eyelet, is really the behavioral biometrics are going to give us the insights to the consumer emotions. And that in terms of how long it typically takes to open up a bank account, and you're kind of struggling with the information or just how a typical user is going to respond to mouse speed, typing speed, and the whole user phenomenon and experience is an indicator. And who would have ever, I have to give you guys credit, because whoever thought that behavior analytics as terms of how you are interacting with a web form and how you're opening up your bank account can really be an indicator of a threat actor that's impersonating the potential account owner. I mean, I think that's just so brilliant. So having that emotional insight there is just really awesome. So Xavier, I'm going to go back to you. What kind of challenges have you seen in terms of balancing that friction and that easy customer experience? And are you using this emotional insight here to kind of figure out if there's some fraudulent activity happening at, the point of entry with your users?
The short answer is yes. We do employ a lot of the similar controls here, looking at user behavior, not only profiling the client's, endpoint on what, type of endpoint it is, determining whether or not it's a real endpoint or an automated bot. But then throughout the process, looking at, how they're interacting with our services. And that's where a lot of our fraud team look at things like is this an account a mule, is there abnormal activity, and so there is a lot of behavioral controls throughout our stack, from both security and cyber protection to fraud, and that's been the biggest benefit, is that we want to allow as much business through without imposing on of our clients, and making sure that our application owners can design the best application for their business, and security and fraud is able to then utilize whatever is designed there to then determine whether or not people are misusing that particular application.
So Ayelet, Xavier kind of touched on these points, that they're using this type of emotional insights to detect fraudulent activity on the access and opening of different types of accounts out there. What do you think security teams from across your client perspective how are they really leveraging these emotional insights as well? I think certainly Xavier is talking about a best practice, but what are you sort of seeing out there, and I'd love to talk a little bit about some of the pain points that that are there, and the victims to online fraud. Certainly, we're not. This is what is trying to prevent a sort of a faceless hacker attacking a real person through the way they're opening a simple account and stealing their identity out there. So love to get your perspective on these pain points and how the security teams can really use this as a real gusto for protection with their customers.
Sure. So as Xavier was saying, really, we in the financial industry for a very long period of time, we've been in this arms race with cyber criminals, looking at IP intelligence, device intelligence, other controls to say, does this look like a user we've seen before or no? That's the fundamental question when it comes to account takeover protection. And the fundamental question when it comes to account opening is this the legitimate user whose identity we're seeing? Is that really that person? So these are challenging questions to answer. And the challenge with traditional controls like device and IP, they're still valid. They're just not enough. We need to augment them with additional layers, because cyber criminals are, leveraging, they're spoofing location and IP, and they're stealing cookies and replaying device elements. They're really, really sophisticated. They're remote access attacks, like you mentioned earlier, Marcy. So how do we answer fundamentally this question? And using behavior is really efficient in scenarios where it's actually the legitimate user who's committing the fraud themselves without knowing. So one example is the case of scams, real-time scams, where a cyber criminal is picking up the phone, calling someone and tricking them to move all of their money to a different account, to the cyber criminal account. They're impersonating a bank professional or a government professional representative and saying, this happened to your account. They might actually obtain a lot of information about that person on the dark web, or even have the ability to log into their bank account with stolen credentials without doing anything. So they can't do the payment because there are controls there, but they can look into the account and say, okay, you made this transaction, but did you make this transaction? And then they make something up. They pressure the legitimate user and trick them into transferring all their money. So when we look at that type of activity from a fraud control perspective, if we use the traditional controls of transaction level analysis, of device intelligence, of IP, we won't necessarily be able to catch that activity because it is the legitimate user. they are able to pass all forms of multi-factor authentication. So how can we tell that it's not them? So by looking and saying, okay, it looks like the legitimate user, but something about their activity is off. Their emotions are not in touch with what we typically see. Typically, banking is not an emotion-driven activity. You go in, you pay your bills, whatever you need to do, and you log out. But when there is emotion involved there, that's where leveraging those behavioral insights and emotions comes in play. I wanted to give a second on how we can detect those emotions, because I think it's critical to understand. So we can look at behavior at 3 levels. The first level is the user level, and saying, does this look like the user we've seen before in this account? So device, IP geolocation, different levels of activity, fingerprints, etc., but also their behavior, how they use their mouse, the speed of their typing, their cadence, things like that. Those are patterns that we can over time learn for a user and then detect anomalies. The second level of analysis is a population level. What does a cyber criminal population act like? What does a legitimate user population act like? So I gave the examples of long-term and short-term memory earlier, or familiarity and fluency with a form. That's a population level analysis, correlating activity with good and bad behavior. So for the example of the scam I gave before, if we look at the user level, it will look like a legitimate user, no anomalies there. But when we look at the population level or other activities, we'll see indicators of something is off here, like very lengthy sessions, or being someone dictating on the phone. So we'll see mobile device movements. Mouse doodling is something that we see a lot. Someone just aimless motion with their mouse. A lot of different behaviors that combine together provide a powerful indicator that there's emotion involved here that's abnormal. And that could be used to predict some cases like that.
So Phyllis, from these online financial decisions and transactions that are out there, what are we seeing, to foster trust with our end user population out there?
Well, I think if we think about our end user population, we want them to be educated. We want them to be aware of the risks, and we, of course, want them to behave as good citizens. So, in the situation mentioned where a person was acting as a mule and setting up fraudulent accounts, right, to launder money or something else, that's not a situation that's going to generate trust. So anything that we can do to get to know our customer better is going to help generate that trust, is going to help us have the additional biometrics so that we know what good behavior is and can start to build up that profile, or as I said, multiple profiles, looking at the different levels. So I think that's where you were going with it, Marcy, but ask me again if I was off on that a little bit.
No,
Okay.
no, you hit it on the head, actually. And just sort of moving on to our next area, really talk about how to leverage the data now to really have a maximum effectiveness, because we're gaining the insight now to how the user is interacting with the web form or the different transaction tools that are out there, just in general, their digital behavior. So we're learning what the perceived intent might be. So how do we translate this amazing information that we're gathering, this data analytics, into real actions are we monitoring, are we monitoring to each individual session in the app and website of how they would interact, and, ensuring that, of course, the quality of the user experience, but still that personalization that's really important when you're engaging online. So David, I'm going to go back to you actually again. The data, this is really unique data. And I think this is actually a total game changer of how you can really win the customer's trust and loyalty because of the seamless interactions. I know that there's personally different, e-commerce tools and websites and things out there that I prefer versus not prefer, in things that I'm doing and, overall. So how do we take that data and work with, the data analytics team, the marketing team to drive that user personalization and fostering the end user experience, but still creating a very trusted transaction?
It's a great question because usually there's these silos even between cyber protection, cybersecurity, and fraud. So breaking down those barriers is one important step. Making sure that while cybersecurity might care more about authentication, right, coming in the front door, making sure they're not doing any SQL injection, things like that. But then fraud is going to care a lot more about once they're in the application doing inappropriate things like that. So that behavior analysis has to bridge across those domains. And you also highlighted another one that's very important is the marketing and those line of business folks, that not knowing what their what their clients are doing is important for a number of reasons. Not only to keep the attackers at bay, but also to help sell more services and know more about their clients to serve them better. And so so when talking to our lines of business, that's the context that we use. Is not that, hey, we're here to keep the bad guys out, because they just assume we do that for them. Yeah, cyber's got that, right? No, you'll keep the bad guys out, but it's more along the lines of, hey, we're detecting certain types of behaviors, and can you utilize this not only to protect your clients, but also to fold that back into a business driving situation, and then the business gets engaged. And so now we're able to use that behavioral data across both cyber, fraud, and the line of business.
So Phyllis, leveraging this type of data out there, how do you think it could be useful for organizations to simplify the user experience overall, and ongoing, benefit the customers that are out there?
Oh, no, I think this is a tremendous tool for that. If you stop and look at where is there the hesitation, right? Where is there kind of the searching on an individual web page when they're trying to do something? So, obviously they're not seeing that particular drop down, or they're not seeing that pop up. They're having to search for it. So when you know where their journey is going to end and you look back at that path, I think that there's a huge amount of information there that anyone who's into user experience is going to glean a tremendous amount from. I think for me, this is the first product where I've seen that crossover between security and the user experience, and trying to bring them together as seamlessly as possible. Very cool stuff.
So kind of topping on what Phyllis said here about the simplifying the user journey and overall, what data can we use to really modernize these analytics for better decision making with our respective colleagues that have different parts of these different interfaces with the apps and website and everything like that? So to me, it's just like the interconnectivity between the different groups that are building and managing these apps and websites are just in for a wonderful experience. There's like a whole team of people that really benefit. So anyway, love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, and I would also like to build on what Xavier said earlier with those different stakeholders in the organization. It's very important to consider not only the fraud prevention and the security controls, which kind of taken for granted, I think, by these teams, which is fine. We would expect them to. And I think leveraging this data can really help both sides. So one is, of course, the fraud prevention, reducing the fraud. So having visibility into what really happened in this type of activity. For example, did we see a remote access tool attack, or did we see manual account takeover? Those will impact the decisions of allow, decline, authenticate, what authenticator to use. Is it out of bound? Is it inline? Those decisions will be based, like if it's a scam, then don't authenticate the user, delay that and call them, talk to them. But if it's a manual account takeover, then use out of band authentication and you'll be fine. You'll let the genuine users continue. So that's one side. The other side is enabling more business, right? So if you have confidence that this is a legitimate user, you don't need to have all that, manual review or offline. You don't need to slow down the process. So it appeals to that side of the business, gaining confidence, understanding why it's genuine, and really elevating the confidence in that seamless activity. And we've seen, a conjunction of many tools used to prevent fraud. And when those tools have conflict, that data can help us resolve the conflict and really understand, okay, from this perspective, like this social security number is outdated or belongs to someone who's deceased, unfortunately, but the way the user's behaving, they really know their data. So maybe there's a typo and not, we don't need to reject this customer. We can actually go and check and acquire more business. So those are kind of the benefits there.
So I want to kind of ask a broad question to sort of all of you, because we're doing some data collection, at the end of the day about the user, how quickly they're potentially typing in or interacting with the application. Is there any private data privacy concerns now that kind of come up here in terms of your business leaders? There's GDPR, but you still may be a domestic website, but there's all these different state privacy rules that have, or laws that have coming into effect. And so how does it play there? Phyllis, you want to kind of take a stab at that first, or?
Well, for me, what we're trying to do here is to go back to one of your earlier questions. We're establishing trust between ourselves and that consumer. And this helps to build that trust. If the data is maintained after the fact, but only in the aggregate, almost like an AI learning type situation, and not specific to this particular consumer, I don't think we've got a data privacy issue. So again, it's how are you going to use that data once you have it? If it's to authenticate and protect that consumer, I believe we're absolutely fine. But I look to you for, I'm sure that you've got lawyers all over this.
Absolutely. So along the lines of what you said, first of all, we're using the data to protect users, but the data that we collect is these elements of interaction. So we don't know who the user is. We get a hashed, anonymized ID from financial institutions, and we build profiles based on user XYZ, and then that interaction happens, or the profile is built around this user. And of course, the other levels of population level analysis, that's all anonymized and not looking specific users. And this data is used to protect the end users and therefore legitimate under different regulatory requirements. Absolutely.
Perfect. Well, Xavier, do you want to sort of add to that point before we start up with our questions?
Yeah, it's something we have to keep an eye on because it is a ever-changing playing field there. Being a U.S. bank, we get to put our blinders on with a lot of the GDPR stuff. But of course, with California law coming in, there's multiple other state laws. What is legal today could be, something different tomorrow. And yeah, so we definitely have to keep that under consideration and our privacy teams informed when we start breaking down those barriers, because it used to be that they would just assume that anything collected for security purpose would remain in that team. But as soon as we start bridging that data, does that mean that we now are addressing a different regulatory aspect? And so yes, it is a continual situation that as soon as we get it figured out, it'll change on us next week. So it keeps us on our toes for sure.
And Marcy, I wanted to add another point following Xavier's comment. Of course, I completely agree with that. It is something that we all need to be mindful of. Another element here is leveraging AI and the need for model governance under regulatory requirements. And that's something that we see. We work with our customers all the time, and we have a team that supports model governance, but that's just another consideration out of the many considerations when choosing solutions. It's important to be aware of that need as well.
Well, perfect. Well, thank you guys. I just want to jump into our questions now because we've got one from Belinda Mobley here. And this is for Phyllis. How can organizations demystify cookies and analytics for customers so that they'll opt into additional tracking? Now, I see this as an important and protecting them. And that's actually a really great point, because every time I'm going to these websites right now, I mean, literally even to opt out of something that you didn't subscribe to, they're making you opt into a cookie. So Phyllis,
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any insights here on that.
It's true. I think I would look at it as a consumer who gets hit with that question all the time as well. And I think to almost, if you could make it playful on top of the legalese, it's much more appealing. Make it less threatening. Every time I am hit with a screen full of legalese and the "do you accept cookies" statement, I freak a little bit. And it's like, what is it that I'm doing? So we can't always
Right.
stop and educate them, but we can demystify it a little bit.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point. And Ayelet, what are your thoughts on this actual topic? I know that's not really what exactly you guys do, but there's some, again, it goes to that trusting of the interaction of the whole user experience here.
Yeah, and I think that, and this is a best practice that, I think we all need to deploy, even BioCatch in our website, etc., is simplifying that experience for the user. So really short, simple explanation of what's really happening, why it's a good thing, why it's used to, how it's used to protect them, and not just this really lengthy, you talked about attorneys earlier, Xavier, not that really lengthy policy up front, but something simple to begin with, so they know, and it's easy for them to orient and make selections, and then all the rest later. So just simplifying the cookie experience as part of the holistic user experience, I think, is best practice here.
Well, I have one final quick question for you guys. The security measures, which one for you, and this is like a fast kind of challenge answer right here, the security measures that are non-negotiable. So quick word answer, Xavier, what's non-negotiable here?
Well, I mean, authentication's on there, but we have to, identify the person through authentication, and that's always the biggest gap. Is that we say we have to authenticate, that implies identity, and that's where this, a lot of the use cases we've talked about today is talked about when other people have those credentials, what happens. And so authentication is obviously a simple one, but that tying that to identity is very important.
Non-negotiable authentication. Phyllis, we've just got a couple minutes before we wrap up.
But I have to agree, Xavier. It all starts with identity. Have you authenticated? Do we know who you are? And that may not happen just with credentials, to your point.
Absolutely. All right, Ayelet.
So I have to say behavioral biometrics, right? That's in my mind the right one, but the broader picture is what is future proof, what is not going to participate in this arms race with cyber criminals, cannot be copied, spoofed, replayed. Those are the controls that need to be in place.
Perfect. I love it. Awesome. Behavior analytics and authentication. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I have felt like this was such a fun and great discussion. Thanks to BioCatch for being our sponsor today. If you'd like to learn more about BioCatch, please reach out to Ayelet Bigger-Levin. She would love to chat with you some more. Don't forget to fill out those surveys. We'd love to get your feedback about today's program. And then additionally, we would love to see you at some other upcoming events. So check us out online at 10-inc.com, our schedule page. We've got quite a few things still coming up. And of course, our ISC Award nominations are open. So we look forward to seeing you, and we hope that everyone stays healthy and safe. And again, I want to say thank you, Ayelet, and thank you, Phyllis, and thank you, Xavier, for being with us today. You guys were so much fun, and this was just a really awesome topic, and I hope to see you next time. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we're closer to Friday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.